So Cameron Naficy is a landscape ecologist whose research interests include disturbance dynamics in temperate forests, historical ecology, ecological feedbacks, plant ecophysiology, and forest policy and management. During the LIM project, he was a postdoctoral research scientist at UBC, and now a research associate in the Department of Forest Ecosystems and Society at Oregon State University. He's worked in temperate forests in many portions of the Southern Hemisphere and in Western North America with a long-term focus on the Rocky Mountains. And Lori Daniels is a professor of forest ecology in the Department of Forest and Conservation Sciences, where she directs the Tree Ring Lab at UBC. Her research examines historical disturbances like fire and insects, interacting with human impacts and climate change in the montane forests of Western Canada. Yeah, as with, I mean, and I should have said this at the beginning, I think, you know, the quality of the people that we had doing this work and in all of aspects of LIM was pretty extraordinary. So I just wanted to, another shout out. We've got some world-class people in all of these LIM elements. And so with that, I will turn it over to Cameron and Laurie.
Thanks, Dave. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to jump in to talk about what we've been doing on the ground over the last few years, trying to dig into the historical dynamics, understand these both in a site-specific or a place-based way, as well as really try and honor the effort that Dave mentioned earlier to scale up our interpretations and be able to understand a little bit more in detail what's happening across this a very broad scale landscape here. And really what I want to talk to you about today, I think some of our findings are quite interesting and I think force us to try and begin to reimagine what foothills forests look like compared to what they are today and what they may, again, begin to look like. So we had three key research motivations that I want to share with you. The first was really just trying to understand some of the geographic variability of the fire regime characteristics across this very broad landscape. We had several reasons to believe that there might be more complexity in the fire regimes of these ecosystems than we had previously recognized. And of course, the big question that came out of some of those initial studies that Dave mentioned within the foothills further north of were there mixed severity fire regimes, what did those mean and how widespread were those, really drove some of these sets of questions, trying to understand across this landscape how much variability and where and why that was playing out. The second was understanding if these regimes differ from what we thought historically, how do they differ? What are the ecological dynamics that actually characterize the fire regimes and the landscapes that emerge from them? And then one question that was really an interesting opportunity afforded by this landscape because of the frequency of fire that we've been able to document within it was how a landscape, especially a fire-sensitive landscape, as much of this landscape is dominated by lodgepole pine, aspen, and a few other fire-sensitive species, how it can maintain resilience in the face of what is quite frequent fires will show, especially for this type of ecosystem, and compared to the ecological models that we've traditionally used to frame ecosystem dynamics in these forest types. So this is the study area. Dave presented this earlier. What I'm showing you here are just some of the major vegetation transition zones with some of the grasslands here moving into the montane zone in brown and the subalpine forest here in blue. You can see the system of reservations that are on the landscape today, national parks here. This is Banff in the north and Waterton in the south. What we did is we wanted to sample broadly across this landscape, and that's what was a really important decision space with this kind of work. We divided our sample sort of into two different regions. One is sort of the northern region here, which encompassed the Elbow River watershed down south to Sheep River Provincial Park. And then in the southern portion, we had this kind of east-west gradient of sample sites that encompassed a lot of the Old Man area. This is sort of the Livingston Gap area here, the Bob Creek wildland, the northern portion of the Porcupine Hills, and some adjacent portions of the foothill zones. And this southern area within the montane zone where you see the crosshatch here is what we call sort of the Douglas-fir zone. Douglas-fir doesn't cover every square inch of that landscape, but it's present throughout a lot of that landscape. Whereas in the montane zone, in the northern portion of our study area, Doug-fir is largely absent. So that's a major difference between these two. And what we did is we went into these different areas and we tried to stratify a sample very broadly across the most important gradients that we could identify in this landscape, gradients of different forest types, of elevation, of potential disturbance histories and complexities. And we sampled both age structure to inform us about the responses to fires and timing of fires, as well as fire scars that really told us about the history of fires on the landscape. I'm going to present a lot of results today based on this set of classification types. These are ordered generally from drier forest types to more moist forest types. So relatively pure Douglas-fir forests, dry mixed conifer forests, which are similar. Douglas-fir is an important component of these, but there may be aspen mixed in, and a few other species. Moist mixed conifer forests, which were oftentimes a mixture of lodgepole pine and aspen, sometimes spruce, but a very diverse mix or assemblage within these stands. Relatively pure lodgepole pine stand. This is probably the dominant forest type within the region. Pure aspen stands, some mixed wood stands, which could be a mix of aspen with different conifer species, and then relatively pure spruce forests. One of the major takeaways that I'll highlight as I dig into the data that informs this statement is that we found fairly widespread evidence of mixed-severity fire regimes, as Dave mentioned earlier, these regimes where fire effects were changing over time. So they weren't always high severity, they weren't always low severity or something between, but they varied a lot over time and spatially across the landscape. And these fire regimes really differed for different portions of the landscape, and that's the contrasting mixed-severity fire regimes that I refer to here and we'll dig into now. One of the really striking things about this landscape, especially the lodgepole pine portion of the forest, where classical ecology tells us that these were longer interval fire regimes with very severe fires, and they were able to recuperate in between these major fire episodes, just as a function of having enough time to sort of recover and form forested stands again. And lodgepole pine is a very fire sensitive species. It has thin bark. It's not thought of as a fire resistant species, even though it is quite fire adapted. We all know about the serotinous cones of lodgepole pine. So it can make its way back into even a severely burned landscape quite quickly, but it's not thought to be very resistant to fire. So the idea of it surviving multiple fires is somewhat striking. And what we found was actually very frequent fire within this landscape, and a lot of evidence of frequent fire in this landscapes. We found fire-scarred material throughout the northern and southern portions, including many fire scars that had 2, 3, sometimes more fire scars. Fairly well-preserved records, and more than we expected to find in these forests. And when we sort of boil down all this data, what I'm showing you here on these graphics is the same series of forest cover types: Douglas-fir, dry mixed conifer, Douglas-fir, lodgepole pine, aspen, mixed wood, moist mixed conifer, and spruce, again, organized kind of from drier to moister forest types. And here I'm just showing you box plots of the median fire intervals from all of our samples across this large landscape. And you can see, in general, this is really quite frequent fire. Douglas-fir forest had extremely frequent fire. I'll put this into context a little bit later on, but median fire intervals of around every 20 years across a pretty broad swath of area. Many of the other forest types had slightly longer fire intervals, but for lodgepole pine, again, the dominant forest type in this zone, this is really frequent fire. We're seeing median values of between 30 to 45 year fire return intervals for a forest type that oftentimes is thought to have return intervals on the order of 100 to 400 years, right? So this is very frequent fire for this ecosystem. And this frequent fire pops up in our samples in other ways as well. I'll draw your attention to this graphic here, which shows again some of the same these are actually tree species rather than forest types. And this is just a measure of how long was it in between the pith, essentially the birth date or the establishment date of a tree, and the first scar. And for lodgepole pine, what we find is that most of our lodgepole pine where we found preserved scars had scarred at some point within the first 20 to 40 years of its life. So fires that were going through these stands of 20 to 40-year-old lodgepoles and leaving at least a certain number of survivors. And you can see that in some of these fire scars here. Some of these trees were very young when the first scar happened. And this suggests certain characteristics of fire behavior that I'll sort of dig into in the next couple slides. What I'm showing you here is our reconstructions of fire severity in these different forest types. Fire severity, as I'm talking about it here, is essentially what percentage of the trees were killed, what percentage of the canopy cover was killed. And we're using a metric called delta SN. The details here are not important, but what this metric means and how you interpret it is 0 would be sort of moderate severity fire. Anything negative would be lower severity fire, and anything positive would be higher severity fire. And I've color coded these graphics according to that definition, just for visual interpretation. And what I'm just showing are these frequencies, sort of histograms of the distribution values for each of the different forest types. And if you look across each of these forest types broadly, what immediately is apparent is that there was a lot of variability in fire severity across all of these different forest types. And that variability, of course, differed for each of these different types, but it suggests that this mixed severity fire regime idea was quite prevalent within this landscape. If we look at some of the major vegetation types, Douglas-fir, what we find is that it is a very clearly mixed severity fire regime, but its general skew or its sort of central patterns are centered around low and especially moderate severity fires, with the smaller component of high severity fires. If we look at lodgepole pine, it's a mixed severity fire regime as well, but a very different flavor of mixed severity fire. Much more severe fire, just consistent with how we thought about lodgepole historically, but also a really important component that represents about 30% of our samples recorded low or moderate severity fire. So more skewed towards that higher severity end, but with this important characteristic of some low and moderate severity fires mixed in. Sorry, this is the lodgepole pine here. And if we look across the rest of the forest types, what you see, again, is quite an important mix, or an almost even mix in many cases, of the different severity classes. So different types of mixed severity regimes depending on the forest type or the forest zone. Oops, sorry, that shows up again. And if we put these, one way to visualize the overall fire regime is to place each of these forest types within fire regime space that's defined by the median fire interval here on the y-axis and the severity. And the way to read these graphics here again is frequent fires to less frequent fires on the y-axis, lower severity fires to higher severity fires here. These lines represent approximate thresholds between what we would expect for lower severity fire regimes to the left here, mixed severity fire regimes in the middle here, and higher severity fire regimes to the right here. And there's a couple major points that I think are important to mention here. One is that we see a lot more variability in the severity component of this fire regime space than we do frequency, right? So fire severity varied a lot more than the frequency of fires did for many of these forest types. If we look at Douglas-fir specifically, you can see it falls here right at the sort of dividing line between low and mixed severity fire regimes. So definitely a lower to mixed severity fire regime model with very frequent fires. This differs a little bit from some of the studies of this same type of forest in other areas. It's not a very well studied forest type, but from some of the data from other regions, for instance, in Yellowstone, where I did my dissertation work, it would fall more in this area. So actually the Douglas-fir forests in this region do fall out. They stand out to me as being more frequent and lower severity than what I'm used to for this forest type. And if we look at the Douglas-fir zone overall, which is comprised of these different forest types here, dry mix conifer Douglas-fir forest, moist mix conifer forest, some mixed wood, what we see is that this Douglas-fir zone was an intermix of forest types with contrasting fire regimes. And if we look at lodgepole pine, what we see is, again, that it's more towards this, the higher end of the mixed severity spectrum with intermediate fire frequencies. But again, this contrasts with what we know about lodgepole pine forest from many other studies in many other regions and being much more frequent and lower severity than what we classically have come to expect. And within this lodgepole pine forest zone, fire regimes were much more similar. You didn't have the strong contrast between fire regimes of different forest types within that zone. And this just shows some of the geographic variability for the Douglas-fir, our study sites that are in the Douglas-fir zones versus the lodgepole pine zones. And you can see how some of this variability existed within the landscape as well. For instance, in the lodgepole pine zone around Livingston Gap, this Old Man West site was a little bit more severe and with slightly longer fire intervals than some of our other lodgepole pine zones. So this is how we can begin to parse apart some of this geographic variability. And the other point that's really an important one that's come from this work is represented here in these graphics using something that we call the stand replacing equivalent. The way to think about this is it's an index of how many years or how many fire events it takes for a stand to reach cumulative high severity fire effects. How long does it take for that full turnover of that stand that's equivalent to a high severity fire? It could be one event if it was a high severity fire. It could be multiple events if they were lower severity fire. What we see is Douglas-fir had somewhat longer values for each of these, whether in terms of years or in terms of events. So it took about 130 to almost 200 years for any given site to turn over fully within this landscape. And that turned out to be about 7 to 9 events. And if we look at lodgepole pine forests and many of these other forest types, what we see is a very different pattern, much more transient landscape dynamics that characterize these forest types in this forest zone overall. The landscape is essentially being turned over, recycled every 20 to 40 years. Most lodgepole pine weren't surviving more than 2 events maximum, although a few survived 3, 4, or 5. But really transitory dynamics overall. And this brings us to really think about the foothills forest in a very different light. They were young forests, but they were complex forests and very transient dynamics. And that's what I want to show you here. At the onset of fire exclusion in around the 1930s, this landscape was comprised of predominantly young lodgepole pine forests across a very broad area. You can see that here, the net effect of this fire regime on this landscape was that the median age of these stands was between about 20 to 40 years. Douglas-fir forest had a much larger range. There was actually quite an important component of younger forest in these landscapes as well, but the average or median ages were quite a bit higher, more than 150 years, and there were some very old forests included within these landscapes as well. And if we look at these graphics here, which just show aggregate patterns of establishment in the lodgepole pine zone and in the Douglas-fir zone in relation to when fires occurred. These peaks show how widespread different fire years were. What we see is that most of the lodgepole pine regeneration in the zone was initiated by the last series of relatively major fires in the area, whereas Douglas-fir has some of that as well, but actually this tail of much older forest that has survived multiple fires. And the other thing to look at here is this little inset graphic, in particular for lodgepole pine, which just is showing the frequency distribution of patches that we're recording each cohort, each fire-initiated cohort in the landscape. And the main pattern to notice here is that there was some cohorts that were extremely widespread. These came from things like the 1910 fire. But most of the landscape was comprised of cohorts or age cohorts that weren't, that differed from their neighbors. Right, these suggest a fine scale patterning of the age structure characteristics across the landscape. And we wanted to characterize this. So one of the things that we did was use some cluster analysis to characterize the age structure of these different forest types. And the analysis led us to these 3 groups that we just call simple, intermediate, and complex. Simple stands are these classic even age stands. Intermediate age stands usually had 2 cohorts, that survived at least one fire. And then there are these much more complex stands that had more frequent fire, more complex age structures. And if we look at how these different types or classes of forests were distributed across this gradient of forest types, what we see is that Douglas-fir forests, for instance, had very little even-aged forests and were pretty evenly dominated by a combination of intermediate to complex age structures. Lodgepole pine had this really important component of even-aged forest, but also, again, this mix of intermediate and even some complex forest that arose from this history of mixed-severity fires. And if we think specifically about the lodgepole pine zone and what the overall landscape dynamics or the picture landscape dynamics that emerges from all this work, this is how I like to sum it up. And there were kind of two different modes of landscape dynamics that I think emerged from our data. One is these zones on the lower foothills that were dominated by lodgepole pine and a really important component of aspen. And they exhibited these really complex patchworks. You can see here some areas that were stand replacing these almost savanna-like areas of lodgepole pine that had survived fires, multiple cohorts of young forest in close association. You can see here in the foreground an area of aspen that's regrowing that was burned by a fire, and that cohort that emerged from a previous fire. So two aspen cohorts and very close in adjacency to each other, both of them very young. So this really complex mosaic of young forest. And here, the other type of regime that I feel like we've seen in this landscape is a slightly coarser, regime. Again, a mixed severity regime, but you can see many more areas of open grassland, oftentimes a lower component of aspen. You can see it in some stands, but not as many. Not as many complex stands and a coarser mosaic overall with more high severity. These tended to be set back a little bit further in the mountains, so along this elevational gradient. And if we look at the Douglas-fir zone and what we understand of its landscape dynamics from this, I'm showing you here a set of pictures. This is an aerial image from the early 1920s with an inset shown focused in here, and these letters correspond to the location of different images that we've taken. And you can see some really complex patterns on a mesoscale, where we have large areas like this here that were blown out in high severity fire, such as we see here in A and D. And interestingly, in some of these forests, not all of them, we would see remnants of really old Douglas-fir trees, stands of them in some cases, contained within these areas that were growing back as very dense post-high severity forests. So evidence of sort of state switches in some cases. We'd see other areas like E here, these multi-age stands, intermediate age stands with lots of fire scars. We'd see these open savannas of young forest, such as in C and F here, sometimes with older trees intermixed, but predominantly young stands growing in grasslands. And then some stands, such as B here, of really old Douglas-fir forest that had survived multiple fires. And these are just some examples of what the age structure graphics look like from some of these. So even age forests as an A and D here, intermediate age forests, old growth forest here in B. And what I think a lot of this has led me to think towards is this idea that I've started out with and that I circle back to now, which is reimagining the forests of the Alberta foothills as a young, complex landscape that was in a lot of flux. And you can see that when we look back to some of the photos from the Mountain Legacy program. I'm going to take us through a tour of some of them because I think I want to drive home what we are seeing in our data and what I think you can see visually in a lot of these photos. And they really help you to take in what that meant for this landscape, the scale of it as well, which I think is really important. Again, you can see young forest surviving lodgepole pine within some of this burn landscape from mixed severity regimes, multiple cohorts of very young forest interspersed over short distances. And this characterized very large portions of this landscape. These are images from the 1940s. You can see some of the complexity of and heterogeneity in these recent burn patterns mixed in with the unburned areas. And again, realizing that both the burned areas and unburned areas, again, are part of this very young 20 to 40-year-old lodgepole pine forest. Here's a slightly older series of burn scars. This is an image from 1913, taken just a few years after the 1910 fire passed through the Old Man River, the Livingston Gap area. And what it shows, all of this together, is really that the title of this project, I don't think we knew how appropriate it might be in the end, but this really was a landscape in motion. And to drive this home, the way that I've been thinking about this is how much this contrasts with our lived experience. And if you put this in terms of what that would be if we were living in this landscape, it means that within each of our lifetimes, the landscape that we know, that we love, that we recreate in, would have changed dramatically, not only just once, but multiple times. It's really sort of, I think, important to think about how these results put us in that place and in this very different reality. And the last set of points that I want to talk about today have to do with the influence of Indigenous fire use within this landscape. It's always difficult to make interpretations about this. We're always lacking data, but there's some really strong suggestions in our data that Indigenous fire use was a very important part of the dynamics that I've just described. And I want to talk about what some of that evidence is and what it means. One of the things we know is that the foothills are in a lightning shadow. Here's the Continental Divide. This is some data from the Jasper and Banff area, and you can see that there's very high lightning densities on the west side of the divide and much lower lightning densities on the east side of the divide. So this is the lightning shadow effect, which suggests we have potentially a limitation of ignitions. Another thing we found is in our data sets, and others have found this in their data sets in this region, is a very high occurrence, much higher than is normal for this region, very broadly speaking, of fire scars that suggest spring to early summer fires, or potentially even winter fires, rather than these sort of late summer fires that we're accustomed to seeing and that we think about more commonly. And this has been suggested more broadly in here as well as a signal of Indigenous fire use. And of course, we know that this was a landscape that was lived in by a number of different Indigenous cultures, especially the Blackfeet and several others. And there's very abundant archaeological evidence of this that dates back over hundreds and thousands of years. This is a graph of our fire history data showing some of the major fire years here. And one of the things we've done that's important is just to break these up into different fire sizes, essentially. And that's what we've done here with the coloration. You can see, based on the percent of our patches where we recorded an individual fire year, how widespread they were. So fires like the 1910, 1863 fire years were extremely widespread within this landscape. Others were intermediate, but still quite widespread. And here in green, we have these widespread fires. And then we've got a lot of these local fires in blue. So sort of different patterns of fire sizes and scales of wildfire within this region. And what's really interesting here, I'm going to talk about the record from about the 1800s to the present, because it's the portion of America that's strongest. And what I want to draw your attention to are some major transitions and patterns that jump out from this data. During around the 1880s to 1890s, this was really a period of major cultural transition for the Indigenous groups in the area. Treaty 7 was signed in 1877. The reservation boundaries were being established in the early 1880s. Railroad construction happened in the late 1890s. A series of really major transitions that meant that the Indigenous cultures were transitioning from their historical way of life to much more of a sort of reservation model. And this appears to have had some really important implications for this landscape that show up in our data here. In particular, what you should notice here is that there is what seems like an unprecedented drop-off in the frequency of local scale fires, so sort of smaller scale fires on this landscape. And what we're left with between this period of about 1900s and 1930s, rather than this much more varied pattern of fire sizes, is the decline in small fires and the continuation of only large fire years, 1896, 1910, 1919, followed by finally a drop off in even those large fires with the onset of fire exclusion this is in creating these smaller fires that had probably a lot to do. Cut off. Am I back on?
Yeah, you might want to try just turning your video off, Cameron, just to,
Okay.
just for the last little bit here.
Okay, hold on a sec.
But you are back.
Okay. So that was, yeah, that was the end of that slide. And I'll take us back to the main conclusions, which are essentially that this was a very high fire frequency landscape with mixed severity fire regimes, but these fire regimes differed quite a lot between the Douglas-fir forests that had lower severity fire regimes with a much greater diversity of age structures, including old forest, compared to these lodgepole pine forests that were a higher severity regime with some mix that created young forests overall with really interesting stand level patterns of structural diversity and also landscape heterogeneity. And I think one of the most important points, these really dynamic landscapes that were in quite a lot of flux, changing over decadal scales, essentially. The other thing that's really jumps out of this work is how we might think about wildfires in a context other than mature stands, mature forests, which is where a lot of our research has made its advancements and where a lot of our mental space, I think, is when we think about fires. We tend not to think about them in these young areas that have burned within the last 20, 30, 40 years. We don't think of another fire happening in those circumstances, but it seems like that was actually the dominant pattern within this landscape. And it may force us to consider some really different models of how we think about fire and how it might play out on these landscapes. The other point that is important here is that there's been some work that suggests that these ecosystems, lodgepole pine ecosystems, for instance, might collapse under very frequent fire. And one of the interesting things that we've learned from this landscape is that there are mechanisms of resilience, even in this fire-sensitive forest, to very frequent fire. And what we didn't see in this case that is unexpected in that context is more widespread sort of ecosystem collapse. We saw greater resilience than might have been expected. And part of that, I think our data suggests fairly strongly, is revealed by the patterns of indigenous fire use that occurred in this landscape. And with that, I'll just acknowledge a lot of our collaborators from Alberta Agriculture and Forestry, all of the research team, a number of other collaborators in the foothills and field and lab techs that have really made all this work possible. I'll finish there.